The true educational aim of the Cultural Revolution. Finally, give Chinese trash a chance. From the book I'll Ruin Everything You Are, Ending Western Propaganda on Red China by Ramin Mazaheri. We have no choice but to start at zero with primary sources. The task of the Cultural Revolution is to reform the old education system and education philosophy and methodology. From the Chinese Communist Party Central Committee, May 16th, Directive, 1966, which initiated the Cultural Revolution. Due to its total historical exclusion in the West, I must first address the primary, yet studiously ignored, aspect of the Cultural Revolution, granting mass rural education for the first time. Above all, the explicit task of the Cultural Revolution was a revolution in education, and it is this inclusion of rural voices which naturally revolutionized the urban-dominated post-1949 culture, causing inevitable friction. Indeed, this is the thesis from which to operate. By opening up China's overall national education culture to rural Chinese trash, that necessarily produced conflict with the hitherto urban-dominated communist culture. And the hard-won victory of Chinese trash is what is now appropriately termed a cultural revolution. Another, more universal thesis is this. If one fails to acknowledge the intensity of the urban-rural divide, which is a universal byproduct of the industrial era, one cannot understand the Chinese Cultural Revolution, nor recognize its immediate necessity for a parallel overhaul in the West. But this original aim must be hidden. Denying that the Cultural Revolution actually represented a vast increase in education is a primary propaganda tactic of the West on this issue. Thusly, Fairbank denigrates one of the Cultural Revolution's totally ignored yet absolutely primary programs, the Rural Education Program, as mere indoctrination. And he leaves it at that. In a similar vein, but with the opposite tact, you can find plenty of Western propaganda about the alleged failure of Socialist Cuba's famous literacy drive. But demanding equal education opportunities is surely the sign of a modern Democrat, and Brown refuses Fairbank's dishonesty, willful blindness, and baseline suspicion. Begin quote. The other aspect about the Cultural Revolution was Mao's ardent desire to bring rural education out of the Dark Ages. After 1949, the education system improved dramatically for urbanites, as well as for illiterate adults. But for farm folk, the education system changed little after liberation. It was still controlled by urban intellectual elites who largely scorned the hundreds of millions of peasants in the countryside. The Cultural Revolution changed all that, close quote. The invaluable benefit of sympathetic, open-minded 21st century scholars like Brown is that he is open to the Chinese view of China's history, rather than rewriting it in order to promote Western ideology. Not only is Brown embedded in Chinese society, but he is willing to use modern Chinese sources, such as Dongping Han, who wrote the immensely necessary book, The Unknown Cultural Revolution, Life and Change in a Chinese Village. Westerners, and especially journalists, mostly only talk to those who fled China and bear a grudge. It's the same thing when it comes to Iran, but I shouldn't complain. The anti-Castro faction has far more political power in Florida than the Iranian monarchy's ex-elites in Beverly Hills and around Washington, D.C. We must keep in mind just how much the West has lacked new or different ideas, analysis, and facts on the Cultural Revolution. This is an intellectual battle where Western leftists have long since quit the field, while Chinese expatriate leftists have rarely been present in the West long enough to raise their voice or to be heard. Thinkers like Dongping Han, a professor in the United States, are truly the first of this kind. Given the sustained success of the People's Republic, they certainly will not be the last. Han's facts are undeniably weighty and must be accounted for. when discussing the Cultural Revolution. In 1966, the start of the Cultural Revolution, his village of 1,300 students had 8 middle schools and 2 high schools. When it was over, his county had 249 middle schools and 89 high schools. In 1966, 65% of all rural schools had no desks and chairs. But by the end of the Cultural Revolution, per Brown, begin quote, to say that the Cultural Revolution radically improved the educational foundation of rural China would be a gross understatement, close quote. And to radically improve the educational foundation of rural society is thus to improve all of society. However, it must be retained in mind that mass rural education was seemingly unknown to humanity for our 5,000 years of recorded history, and thus this modern development can affect a national culture in unpredictable ways. If there's one thing a capitalist is, it's impatient. They are simply appalled that any socialist-inspired revolution has taken more than 1 week to succeed. And this is why capitalists are such bad political leaders. Real changes take longer than a financial quarter. But if we look at a timeline of Chinese Communist Party governance, after reversing foreign domination and exploitation, which from 1927 to 1949, then assuring domestic security, the Korean War from 1950 to 1953, and then having boosted urban education and teaching the illiterate, the time came to raise up the rural areas via education. Of course, when rural citizens have achieved equal educational levels, they will insist on, and deserve, equal say in the overall national culture. And spoiler alert, newly empowered Chinese peasants did not want a gradual return to capitalism via revisionism. In a very real sense, which Iranians will understand easily, rural conservatives in China had very often become truer revolutionaries. Many urbanites became increasingly viewed as the more easily corruptible cadres, more easily swayed from the revolutionary path, and more easily swayed from the national cultural morality. The explanation is partially due to class. The rural area was a class segment which still had not been assured of basic needs, education, empowerment, etc., and they wanted them. This is the polar opposite of the West, where urbanites in 2018, in the aftermath of Brexit and the election of Donald Trump, view rural areas as useless, deadweight, burdensome trash. Note my lack of a capital T. A hillbilly progressive, much less a hillbilly revolutionary, is an oxymoron to the West. It is only hillbilly reactionary, although the West never uses reactionary, as that comes from the vocabulary of leftism. However, this anti-rural prejudice is not a universal value, and it is clearly wrong to assume that this was the case in mid-60s China. And yet how many Western white trash have a similarly negative view of their nation's urbanites as the conservative yet revolutionary 1960s era rural Chinese? I hope we are beginning to see the scope of the problem, just how universal and modern it is, and how China addressed this issue 50 years earlier. Acknowledging this problem, that the only democratic choice is to force rural citizens onto a cultural, educational, societal par with urbanites, is a major step to realizing the major goal of the Cultural Revolution, ending the urban-rural divide. And this is a good place to remind us that Cultural Revolution is a Western abbreviation. Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution is the official Chinese name, because this is when Maoism became Maoism, culturally and nationally, by making the rural people at least the equal of their Soviet godmen proletariat, socialist forerunners, factory workers. In 1968, the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution was placing rural on par with urban, uniting the proletariat in greater emphasis than ever before in a cultural sense. The reality, still unperceived by many Western leftists today, is that urban factory workers having significantly higher education and thus higher possible capability for modern political intelligence than the average worker was drastically reduced worldwide after World War II. Factory workers were a vanguard in 1917 Russia, but times change, and often rapidly. In 2018, it is a totally outdated concept that rural people are culturally or politically stupid, because we are all watching the same TV, internet, books, newspapers, media, etc. A huge step in ending rural isolation, increasing equality of media in the United States, goes all the way back to rural free delivery of mail in 1902. It may not seem like much today, but we must remember what conditions prevailed before, and for so long. We must also always remember that politics and economics are moral issues, and thus easily understandable, certainly not technocratic. On top of it all, the idea that knowing how to run a machine is education, but how to run a farm is not, is a stupid, uninformed, and prejudiced idea, and farmers are happy to watch you try and make it look easy. Anti-rural prejudice has been truly as burdensome upon human society as is our long history of anti-female discrimination, and that is big. The Cultural Revolution was, whether one condones it or condemns it, certainly at least an effort to right this perpetual historical wrong. Returning to education, it is certainly true that China did rob Peter to pay Paul. Urban area schools were closed for intermittent periods in 1966 through 1970. But it was not the decade the West often falsely claims. Regardless, the urban closures must be mitigated by the undeniable fact that always too limited education resources were poured into the rural areas during these closures. It is not a coincidence that today we see that this is the exact opposite of French President Emmanuel Macron's education plan, which will close rural classes in order to put the money towards urban areas. French trash is up in arms, of course, but what is never admitted is Macron's true goal, which is the same as the ruling elites always has been, only being bothered to create a technocratic, self-censoring, self-aggrandizing urban elite in order to protect the elite of the elite. Rural values are certainly the opposite of Rothschild banker values, Macron's previous employer. The 1% may own the land, but they don't have to work it like a job. Furthermore, in France, and showing the top-to-bottom American-style changes Macron is rapidly forcing through, often by executive decree, despite controlling Parliament, in order to avoid public debate, is the no, not the labor code rollback, the right-wing immigration bill, the normalization of the state of emergency, the rail privatization, but his university education changes. It rarely got reported internationally, but dozens of universities were closed by massive university protests in the spring of 2018. Students, teachers, unions, and parents are upset that, to quote a protester from one of my PressTV reports, begin quote, Macron's university reforms are going to create a system where people from the rich elite high schools in Paris are going to go to university more often than those from small cities and rural areas. It will mark the end of our system of equally encouraging everyone to pursue higher education, close quote. The French say, once does not make a custom, but this is two clear steps toward recreating a technocratic urban elite and moving away from democratizing higher education for everyone. What is undeniable is that, as Brown repeatedly relates, the rural people of China remember the Cultural Revolution fondly, even if urbanites do not, and even if the urban elites who fled the Cultural Revolution do not, especially when speaking to anti-socialist journalists in their new adopted countries. But the West does not relay voices like Brown or Hahn. They only decry the mistakes of the Cultural Revolution, while steadfastly refusing to acknowledge the solutions and great leap advances, such as in rural education.